A break from the hustle and bustle of the mainland, a unique biking or camping trip, or one of the last places in Singapore that still has its genuine green identity intact. This is what most Singaporeans think of when Pulau Ubin becomes the topic of conversation. Having a local population of less than 40, and when compared to the buildings in the mainland, they seem to be living in the times of Singapore where kampongs were still the norm. A far cry from our concrete HDBs that touch the sky, most of the islanders live in one-story houses that are made of scrap metals and bricks. The local businesses are that of bicycle rental shops, restaurants, and provision shops, and others which mostly cater to that of the mainlanders visiting the island. Such humble businesses would surely not attract the impression that the locals of the village were rich. Unfortunately, that very impression was what got 58-year-old Hun Sai Im killed in a robbery of a provision shop. On the 24th of April 1972, a body floating in the sea was found. A fisherman brought it to the shores of the island and contacted the police. The semi-nude body was that of Hun Sai Im. Mrs. Im was reported missing by her daughter that previous day, after the latter could not find the former in her ransacked house. Mrs. Im was brought to Outram Hospital for an autopsy, and the police's initial assumption of Mrs. Im drowning being the cause of death was soon found out to be wrong. The coroner that examined Mrs. Im, Chow Tzu Cheng, discovered 9 of Mrs. Im's fragile ribs to be fractured, leading her to undergo cardiac arrest, which thus killed her. However, there was something else that further surprised the investigators. Something a bit more disturbing. Abrasions and injuries found on the vaginal wall and thighs. These were the type of injuries one would get when somebody forced one's thighs open. The coroner concluded that the elderly woman had been raped. This revelation prompted police to open an investigation, but made little progress due to the lack of clues, stagnating for months. Nine months later, on the 9th of February 1973, Harun bin Ribbon found himself in the interrogation room of the police. At that time, he was not a current suspect of the murder of Mrs. Im. He was implicated with the police on an unrelated charge, but the investigators tried to trick Harun into thinking that they knew he was involved in her murder to potentially get a lead. It admittedly was a shot in the dark, as Harun could deny it and the investigators couldn't really do anything about it. However, miraculously, they got the right one, as Harun actually confessed to be the one involved, and what's more, gave up his criminal duo, one Muhammad Yassin bin Hussein, to which the police promptly arrested. They recounted the 9-month-old incident to the investigators. Yassin had heard that Mrs. Im made quite the profit with her provision business and hatched a scheme to rob her. He approached his friend Harun to see if he wanted in on his plan. Harun initially neither accepted nor refused the offer, but soon decided to join Yassin. They rowed to Pulau Ubin on a sampan boat and docked at the beach nearby Mrs. Im's house. In order to lure Mrs. Im outside, Yassin disturbed her adjacent chicken farm. Soon after, Mrs. Im emerged outdoors to investigate the disturbance, allowing the duo to subdue and invade her house. The plan had worked. Once inside of the house, Yassin subdued Mrs. Im by pinning her onto the ground and covering her mouth so she couldn't scream for help, while Harun ransacked the place. During the scuffle of Yassin trying to pacify Mrs. Im, the former noticed the latter's baggy trousers slipping off of her. This was when he was, quote, overcome with sexual desire, and as a result, raped Mrs. Im. After Yassin was finished, he noticed that she was motionless. Around this time, Harun had returned with the spoils of their robbery, $40 in cash, 10 packets of cigarettes, and a gold ring. Yassin explained what he did, and the two, not realizing that Mrs. Im was still not moving, brought her to the sea in an attempt to revive her by splashing seawater on her face. This did not work, and they carried Mrs. Im's body into the sampan boat with them before dumping her into the sea. Both Yasin and Harun were charged with the murder of Mrs. Im. Initially, both voluntarily confessed to their crimes, but when the trial began on the 5th of March 1974, the pair retracted their confessions, claiming that the police used threat of violence to get the confession out of Yasin and Harun. They also claimed that investigators promised them that they will only be charged for rape and robbery respectively and escape the hangman's noose. Hence, a trial within a trial started, in which the court decided if the duo's confession could be used as evidence against them. In the end, it was decided that the confessions were valid and therefore could be used as evidence. The defense's defense was that Yasin and Harun had no prior planning of committing murder, as they entered Pulau Ubin without weapons. Moreover, the defense lawyer states that there was no proof that Yasin had any knowledge of the fatal injuries inflicted, or that such injuries were sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death. The prosecution rebutted that regardless if weapons were used or not, as long as it was a robbery with hurt, and that if such injury caused by said hurt is sufficient to cause death, the murder charge would still stand. Ten days later, a verdict was given. In the judge's verdict, they ruled that Yasin intentionally inflicted the fatal injury to Mrs. Im, and such injury was sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death. As a result, Yasin was sentenced to death. Meanwhile, Harun only robbed the place, and as such did not find himself with a murder charge. He was found guilty of robbery by night, and was sentenced to 12 strokes of the cane and 12 years of imprisonment. After this, it seemed like a pretty open and shut case. Yasin naturally appealed his conviction. He appealed to the Court of Appeal, but was dismissed. He appealed to the President for clemency, but was dismissed. He appealed to the Privy Council of London, and he won. Yes, Yasin won his appeal, and escaped the hangman's noose. Normally, in our current day and age, there would only be two avenues of appeal: the Court of Appeal and the President's clemency. However, back in the 70s, there was another way that the accused could appeal his conviction, that is, through the Privy Council of London, and it was through this avenue that Yasin no longer faced death. And let me explain how he did it. Let me read off a few of the more salient points of the case. If it isn't clear, the council's decision was based off mostly on intent. Did Yasin truly intend to kill Mrs. Im? First, you need to know that he was sentenced under Section 300C of the Penal Code, in which it states that if it is done with the intention of causing bodily injury to any person, and the bodily injury intended to be inflicted is sufficient in the ordinary course, it is considered murder. The Privy Council did not agree that Yasin intended to cause Mrs. Im's death, or in other words, they did not agree with the sentence he was charged under. As such, they dismissed his murder charge and lessened his sentence. And though Subhas Anandan, a famous criminal lawyer, was not involved in this case, this was what he had to say in regards to the outcome of this appeal.
In certain countries, you cannot prove murder unless you can prove a motive. In Singapore, we don't have to prove motive. As long as you did an act intentionally, which act resulted in killing somebody is murder. The Privy Council's view was he had no intention to cause any injury, and as such, there cannot be murder. It was unfortunate that the woman died.
I think a good way to describe the thought process behind both the Privy Council and Supreme Court of Singapore is, did Yasin intend to sit on her chest, thus resulting in bodily injury, or did Yasin intend to sit on her chest to cause these injuries, since the act of sitting off her chest was meant to pacify her, not to kill her? Nevertheless, Yasin was no longer in death's row and awaited his new sentence. Normally, when a murder charge is reduced, it's not uncommon for the reduced charge to be one of culpable homicide not amounting to murder. This is because even though reducing a murder charge to culpable homicide means you escape the death sentence, the latter still entails a pretty hefty amount of jail time. However, they found Yasin guilty of causing death by a rash or negligent act not amounting to culpable homicide, under Section 304A of the Penal Code. As such, on 18th May 1976, Yasin was sentenced to the maximum amount of imprisonment possible for this charge. 2 years. That's right, a plain old 2 years with no caning. Though the Privy Council basically gave him a handshake relative to his initial sentence, he wasn't completely off the hook. The Privy Council called for Yasin to be tried for rape back in the Supreme Court, which happened on the 9th of May 1977. During the trial, Harun, his accomplice if you forgot, testified against him. He recounted that after he was finished ransacking the place, Harun found Yasin standing over Mrs. Im, the latter of which was in the process of buttoning up his trousers. Harun asked him what happened, to which Yasin replied that he had intercourse with her. When Yasin took the stand, he explained he neither had intercourse with Mrs. Im nor told Harun anything of the sort. 3 days later, a verdict was given. The judge was not satisfied that Yasin had intercourse with the woman, and get this, while she was alive. Hence, this meant that Yasin was given the benefit of the doubt and was instead charged with attempted rape instead of normal rape. The sentence? 8 years. In summary, this case is a unique one. Yasin was given the benefit of the doubt twice. The first was if he truly intended to kill Mrs. Im, and the second being if he actually had raped Mrs. Im while she was still alive. Not only that, Yasin was handed the objectively better sentence compared to Harun. This case, along with future ones, questioned the ambiguity of Section 300C. What adequately and sufficiently defines murder for both the Privy Council and Supreme Court of Singapore? Whatever the answer is, the option to appeal to the Privy Council was abolished in April of 1994, effectively separating Singapore law and English law. The prosecutor of this case felt like Yasin had no remorse for the killing and raping of Mrs. Im, stating that, quote, "To forcibly rape an elderly female is not a nice thing to do. In fact, it is a nasty thing to do." Yasin's defense lawyer, though relieved that a man who did not intend to kill was spared from the gallows, he still feels disturbed as the life of Mrs. Im was still lost. If you think justice had been appropriately dispensed for Mrs. Im, opinions and discussions are welcome. Thank you for watching.